If people remember back, especially in the first year of the Russia-Ukraine war, the mantra was, and it really still is, that this is an unprovoked attack. And you could tell that this was a public relations term that was kind of coined and mutually decided between the American government and the European governments and the major media, that this is the way that they would frame it. And the problem is such a ham-handed thing, right? Fast forward, many things happened, including America overthrew the government of Ukraine twice in 10 years, in 2004 and 14. And a civil war broke out in Ukraine with America on one side and Russia on the other, backing the two sides fighting after that in the spring of 2014 and all the way leading up through the invasion of 2022. Boris Johnson on the phone with Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, explaining that, yeah, I told the Ukrainians not to do the deal. So it's all right there. And that's all in the book that goes to show. And boy, they should have taken the deal then. Their next best chance was after their great success in September of 22. And it's been all downhill since then.
Welcome to History Experience.
Hey guys, today I'm pleased to welcome Scott Horton, radio host, author, and the host of The Scott Horton Show. He has written books such as Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, and Provoked. How Washington started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine, which is the focus of today's discussion. Thank you, Scott, very much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Could you introduce the book to our listeners?
Well, the title of the book kind of says it all. If people remember back, especially in the first year of the Russia-Ukraine war, the mantra was, and it really still is, that this is an unprovoked attack. And you could tell that this was a public relations term that was kind of coined and mutually decided between the American government and the European governments and the major media, that this is the way that they would frame it. And the problem is such a ham-handed thing, right? I hate to cite this because I don't like it when anybody else ever does, because it's kind of can be meaningless. But there's the Shakespearean thing about the lady doth protest too much, right? When you're like sitting there insisting and insisting and insisting when hardly anyone's even arguing. And they're essentially demanding that no one ever ask what might have led to this, right? There is no might have led to this. What happened was Putin is a very, very bad guy, and he did a very, very bad thing. And so it's an unprovoked attack, and that is all you need to know. And the thing is, for anyone with a critical eye or ear, it ought to have been pretty obvious that, yeah, the people who provoked this war are the ones who are insisting that you don't ask what led to it. And in fact, America, especially the leader of the Western Empire, did a lot to cause this war to happen. Now, the problem is when you say that, people immediately cry, here's another great public relations term that they came up with, that you're denying the agency of other people who were involved in the things that they were involved in. So if, I don't know, if you punch a guy in the face and then he stabs you, and then I say, well, you did punch him in the face. Not that gave him the right to stab you, but the punch did precede the stabbing. Then they cry, no, you're denying the agency of the guy with the knife. But I'm actually not. I'm just saying that these things do happen, and you knew that when you punched him. Same thing here. Vladimir Putin is the leader of the Russian Federation, not anyone in the United States of America. Everybody already knows that. That part of it should go, obviously, without question. Did he make decisions that he made? Yes, he did. Is he responsible for decisions that he made? Why, of course he is. But just like all of us, he's free to decide with whatever power and authority he has within the circumstances that he exists in on the planet, the same planet Earth we're all stuck on with him. And in these circumstances, he had a narrow range of options. And the Americans, mostly, I think, incidentally, but ultimately, even deliberately at the end, narrowed his range of options to the point where he thought he had to start the war now or start it later when it'll be harder. And so made the decision to go. So, responsibility, you can't really quantify it exactly, but if you want to, like, whatever, he's 55% responsible, but America's 45% responsible because leaders since the end of the last Cold War did a hell of a lot to, really, the best way to put it is to put Ukraine in this terrible position where they became the battleground for this major contest of power between NATO and the Russian Federation. So that's essentially the story of the book, is that, yes, this is to a great degree Washington's fault for starting this war.
During the 1990 German unification talks, the Americans promised Mikhail Gorbachev they would not expand NATO eastward, which led him to allow unification. However, many now deny that promise was made. What is their argument, and how did you refute it?
Well, the good thing is that a massive trove of documents related to this question have been released to the National Security Archive at George Washington University. So people can read all the documents for themselves. And I link in my book, I cite in my footnotes extensively the primary sources from these documents. And the title for the first major treasure trove is called What Gorbachev Heard. And then the second one is called What Yeltsin Heard. And they have this massive trove of documents, and it goes to show that, as even Jack Matlock, the second to last American ambassador to the Soviet Union, explained to me, that the original promise came from George H.W. Bush to Mikhail Gorbachev in December of 1990, when he told them that at Malta, at a meeting in Malta, essentially, if you let the Warsaw Pact states go, we're not talking about the Soviet republics now, but the Warsaw Pact states that were really run by sock puppet commie governments run out of the Kremlin, controlled by the Kremlin. If you let them go, then I promise we will not take advantage of that, which was a vague but therefore deliberately broad promise that we are not going to rub this in your face. And the thing is about it is H.W. Bush Sr., that is, acting like a good sport at the time and not, kicking the Soviets while they were down and pushing them too hard, actually allowed for the collapse to happen. If he had been too aggressive, it would have solidified the position of the hardliners. The fact that he was promising a light approach actually sort of took the threat of American and Western intervention and imperialism sort of out of the discussion, while essentially the political leadership of Russia overthrew the last rulers of the USSR, and that is Boris Yeltsin. After a failed commie coup in August of 91, the leader of Russia then, from the right, so to speak, completed a successful coup and essentially just destroyed what was left of the USSR. And so all that happened in the context of George H.W. Bush and his government playing it cool, and at least promising to play it cool and be good sports about this in their victory. As Bush Sr. himself said, I didn't go tap dance on the Berlin Wall. Is he didn't want to rub it in their face and make it more difficult for the reformers, which is exactly what would have happened if he had. But the thing is, though, is that he was lying, and his State Department was lying, and they knew that they were lying. They were, and I demonstrate this in the book. It's all in the timeline. You can see it in the documents. They were telling the Soviets, listen, we're not going to expand NATO. In fact, NATO is going to be irrelevant. NATO is going to become a political organization. Think sort of like the EU plus America. But we're going to replace it as a security organization with what was then called the CSCE, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is now known as the OSCE, which was already in effect and had been in effect since the Helsinki Accords of 1975, and already included the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia were already all in it. So the idea was that there's no threat of NATO expansion here because there's no NATO to expand, really. The security arrangement for Europe will include you guys from the get-go. That was the promise. And in particular, yes, they did promise not just on February the 9th, although that's the most quotable thing, but in February of 1990 and afterwards, the American foreign policy, the State Department under James Baker, as well as the Germans under Hans Dietrich Genscher and the British under Douglas Hurd, their foreign ministries all promised repeatedly, including by the principals too. Margaret Thatcher and John Major also repeated this themselves. Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, of West Germany at the time, also made the same promise. And Francois Mitterrand, the president of France, made the same promise that we will not expand NATO 1 inch to the east if you will allow the reunification of Germany. Now, there is a wrinkle here, and the War Party is right to point out that at the way that they formulated this at first didn't really make sense, because we're talking about reuniting Germany under obviously West German leadership. The commies don't get to stay in power. The West German regime will now rule all of the newly reunited Germany. But what do you mean the NATO membership will only apply to the Western part? Obviously, if it's a reunited state, then the war guarantee has to be to protect all of German territory. That only makes sense in that context, right? So they said, okay, yeah, you're right. That is kind of funky. So what we'll do is we'll just promise not to move our military forces into the former GDR, into the former Eastern Germany. And we'll just keep them where they're at. And we'll promise not to spread them further than that. And that was what ended up in the final treaty on the agreement to allow the reunification of Germany. However, all during this time, all the promises were being made, that the background of that agreement were all the promises being made that we're not going to expand NATO, one, into Eastern Germany, but then two, to anywhere east of that either. And James Baker said this, but Hans Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of West Germany at the time, said this over and over again. Look, man, if we can't go to Eastern Germany, then obviously we can't expand into Poland or Hungary or Romania or Czechoslovakia or any of these things either. So just forget that. You don't have to worry about that. John Major, again, Margaret Thatcher was then succeeded by John Major as Prime Minister of Great Britain, made the same promise that there's no way we're even considering doing anything like that, my boy. Blah, blah, blah. Like all these promises were made over and over. And Genscher's most avowed kind of statements about this were actually made directly in front of James Baker, who did not object in any way to the Genscher formulation. And crucially, Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, went to Moscow and met with Gorbachev. And he knew that the Americans were already kind of trying to rewrite exactly what we mean by our promises. But he pretended not to know that and went with the fuller, I swear to God, not 1 inch ever formulation, and brought that again to Mikhail Gorbachev. And it was on that basis that Gorbachev agreed to Helmut Kohl that, okay, I will not, intervene and prevent the reunification of Germany. And Helmut Kohl said, I'm quoting you on that. And he said, okay. And Helmut Kohl went right outside and made an announcement to the press right there. Gorbachev just said reunification is on. He won't do anything to stop it. And it was based explicitly on that promise. So again, yes, it's true. They did sort of revise it, but it's also true that everybody knew exactly what the deal was at the time. And the Soviets took them at their word. And when the State Department later under the Bill Clinton government went to investigate whether this was true, they found out that, yeah, it is. And they talked to a guy named Kinkel, who had been Hans Dietrich Genscher's right-hand man, who walked them all the way through it and said, yeah, this is exactly what we told them, all right. And then, of course, there was the famous quotes of James Baker and the documents with his writing on it. NATO to become a new political organization, not to spread 1 inch eastward, with all his little stars and exclamation points on it and everything else. And there's another great resource on this, even though maybe her take is not as strident as me, but she lays all of this out, is Mary Elise Surratt in her book, Not 1 Inch. And she's particularly great on the crucial aspect, quite frankly, is Helmut Kohl's trip to Moscow and exactly what he said in order to get Gorbachev to agree to reunification that day. And that was what it came down to, was this promise of not spreading 1 inch to the east. Now, the point is this, and this is in the documents, that they knew that they were going to expand NATO. And they knew that their promises that they were going to shift security responsibilities onto the CSCE that already included Russia was actually just a bait and switch. That was what they needed to hear so that they would acquiesce. Again, Bush didn't want to rub their face in the dirt. He wanted to play it cool. And in fact, he was playing it so cool, he was lying about how cool he was playing it. While in fact, he was, if that makes sense, he was planning all along to expand NATO into Eastern Europe. Now, his right-hand man, Brent Scowcroft, disagreed about that policy, but that was what Bush favored at the time, and it was certainly what James Baker and them favored at the time. And so they knew they were lying, essentially. There's a great academic named Joshua Shifrinson who shows that, by dates, shows that they're already talking about, oh, we're definitely expanding NATO eastward, at the same time that they're telling the Germans they won't. And that, as he puts it very politely, they were being knowingly misleading, right? They were lying about what they intended. And it could, because it would have been a deal breaker, it would have caused a whole different reaction inside Russia, where they were reassuring and reassuring and reassuring was the posture at the time. Now, when the Bill Clinton government came in, they essentially picked up more or less where the Bush people left off. They, stopped and did their reassessment and had their own internal debates about it and all of that. But they essentially pushed the same scam. And even, by, just what, 9 months into his 9 months into his term in 1993, they were already pushing the bait and switch on Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, and saying, listen, what we're going to do is we're going to build up the Partnership for Peace, which does still exist as sort of a funky little thing on the side there. Sorry for using that term twice in this interview, but it's this weird little kind of halfway house toward NATO membership is mostly what it serves as now. But at the time, what they told Yeltsin was the Partnership for Peace, or the PFP, it will be the new security organization in Europe. And you and Ukraine and Belarus and all the Baltics and everybody will all be members of it all together. And it won't be an alliance because we don't need an alliance because there's no enemy. So it's just going to be a security partnership, an arrangement. And you're going to be part of it along with everyone else. And so he says, oh, okay. And so he relaxed through the end of the year while Clinton was lining up Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, which had then by then split from Slovakia, to be the members in the first round, and then got them all lined up, and then announced in the beginning of 1994 that they were going to go ahead and expand new membership anyway. And he said it kind of subtly, but Yeltsin understood it and flipped out about it. And at the end of the year was when they had the famous Budapest conference. And this is where they came up with the Budapest Memorandum, where everyone's promising to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, right? But this is the same conference where they're supposed to be working on the CSCE, and it's becoming and the PFP, and this is where it's becoming clear to Boris Yeltsin that there's a bait and switch afoot, and that really they're going ahead with NATO membership anyway. And so, not for Russia, of course, but for these seam states. And so he gets in a big fight with Bill Clinton. They have, a big argument at the time at that conference. And so anyway, they go on. And again, as Mary Elise Surratt shows, a big part of what happened here was, even though, I'm not sure if she shows all of this, I do show in my book that the supermajority of the Council on Foreign Relations, which was by far the most important foreign policy think tank at the time, the supermajority of them, the State Department, the ambassadors, everybody really involved on the NSC and all of this, they were against this. The consensus was that it was completely unwise to expand NATO because the people ruling Russia right now, they're our friends. They're the ones who overthrew the communists for us and for all of mankind. Why would we, again, against George Bush Sr.'s advice, stick it to them now? Kick them while they're down instead of taking the opportunity to sow seeds of good faith and gratitude for moving forward in the future. After all, they're still sitting on the world's greatest H-bomb stockpile, so it's not like we can fight them. So why not, continue on the path of trying to befriend them in a way that it's like an offer they can't refuse? Why not to just insist on being their good friends? What's it really going to cost us? We're economic competitors in some ways, but like, come on. What could be more valuable than a permanent friendship with Russia? And there were a lot of people who thought that, people in power at the time, not idealists, but like State Department types. And the most famous of them was George Kennan. And he had been the guy who coined the containment policy. He had been the ambassador to Moscow right after World War II. And he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, which is the Journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. It was originally a secret memorandum inside the State Department, and then called the Long Telegram. People can read it. It's called the Long Telegram. And then the public version was called On the Sources of Soviet Conduct. And it was in Foreign Affairs in 1946 by X. Well, X was George Kennan. And what it says is we got to inaugurate this campaign of containment against Soviet communism. Well, here now Soviet communism is gone. And in the 1990s, he starts saying, hey, we should not be doing this, and advising against NATO expansion. But the problem was he was just too late. These debates had already taken place inside the Bill Clinton government in 93 and 94 and were absolutely solidified by the end of, I think, 94. Or I'm trying to remember how I say the book. Was it completely solidified by the end of 95, maybe? But Kennan didn't really start poking his head up to complain about it until he wrote an article for the New York Times in 1997. And there were a bunch of people, including Susan Eisenhower, President Ike Eisenhower's granddaughter, got a list of like 77 career foreign service people, ambassadors, and then generals and admirals and hardcore Cold Warriors to all sign this open letter saying we should not be doing this. Please don't do this. But it was all just too late. The policy was all, completely in motion at that time. And as the defenders of this policy will point out, Poland wanted in, right? The problem is, from a Texan's point of view, is, yeah, but so what? I mean, that should be like 1% of our calculation of whether it's a good idea to bring them into our alliance. They might have all kinds of good and bad reasons why they want to be a member of our alliance. But whether we let them in should be a question of our national security needs, not theirs. And honestly, it's simply like in economic terms, it's a matter of time preference, right? Do we want to take advantage as much as we can now while they're weak? Or do we want to think about the history of the future of the rest of the 21st century? And what is America's relationship with Russia going to look like? And is it going to end in an H-bomb war? Or are we going to be buds? And over how long of a period of time is your time horizon where you value the outcomes when you're making these decisions? There are a lot of people in the Republican and Democratic parties want to stick it to them Ruskies right now as bad as we can while we can, right? Just the same as I was saying. They felt like they had to go ahead and hit Ukraine before it was too late, before they're stronger. That's the way a lot of the West in Europe and the United States feel about Russia. Whereas my argument is that, as we're talking about here, is still the end of the 20th century so far in our discussion, is we're the Western side, Washington, D.C., they're the ones who are essentially playing a dirty game of pool here. They're the ones who are being deceitful and are making all these big promises about the partnership that they want to have with the Russians when they mean no such thing at all. And when they go ahead and start integrating all of these countries. Now, the Americans will say under the Clinton government and later governments that this is purely defensive in nature. NATO's a defensive alliance. We're not going to invade Russia. And quite honestly, no one should believe, whether Russian, American, European, of any kind, that America and NATO mean to invade and launch a war and try to sack Moscow and conquer Russia. We are not going to do that. And Putin knows that we're not going to do that. But see, then they say, so what do you have to worry about? If everyone agrees that this is not just an excuse to build up an invasion force, well then, why could you possibly object? How could you possibly object to us putting bases in Lithuania, integrating Ukraine even into NATO and the rest of these things? And they just essentially shout over and over again, it's a defensive alliance. It's a defensive alliance. In other words, we don't want to hear about your objections. We have already categorized your objections as unreasonable because we already told you it's a defensive alliance. And they say this, I mean, you can see them saying the same kind of thing for 20 years. Like they convince themselves that that's all there is to it. If Putin refuses to accept the defense of this alliance-ness, well, then that's just too damn bad for him. We're going to do it anyway. And so that's the way that they do it. And he really started pushing back after the second round of NATO expansion was in 2004, and which he complained about at the time, but he was trying to work with W. Bush. It was the dawn of the terror war and all that. He was sucking up to Bush as much as he could. But by 2007, he gave this angry speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he attempted to put the Western powers on notice that, like, listen, you can't just run roughshod in every way here, and, you know, essentially trying to stand up for their interests. And they simply refused to hear it. The idea at the time was, and they do, and I have many, many quotes like this in the book throughout the time here, where these people are so arrogant, and they simply say, like, yeah, but Russia's weak. What are they going to do about it? Like, here, we're busy killing Iraqis. We don't even want to hear this, and we don't have to hear this. Like, whatever he's talking about, can't someone else do it? Like, nobody's even working on the problem. Nobody cared. You know, when, in fact, in the W. Bush years, the guy who was the head of the Russia desk on the National Security Council was a guy named Thomas Graham, who was actually very reasonable. And yet, he complained later that, like, well, but the rest of all the Europe desk and the German desk and the England desk and especially the Ukraine desk, these are all different departments. The Russia department and the Ukraine department are different departments. So how do we want to act toward Russia has a lot to do with the thinking over at the Russia desk, and Thomas Graham is actually a pretty reasonable guy. But over on the Ukraine desk, the attitude is we like Ukraine. And that means screw Russia. And so it doesn't matter what the guys on the Russia desk think. The guys on the Ukraine desk want to stick it to them on behalf of their friends, the Ukrainians. And so you have just, in other words, just men and women with their own narrow point of view running this massive empire and pushing on levers of power where they're not apparently very able to correctly estimate the consequences of their actions. And you know, they ended up leading us to this. I guess, you know, I'll stop now. There's obviously a lot that happened between George W. Bush and the current set of problems, but you can see where I'm going with this.
Tell me, why did the United States take a more aggressive approach toward Russia after the Soviet collapse instead of seeking peace?
Yeah, again, it's these kind of short-term ways of thinking rather than long-term. And I'll give you a great example is in the Bill Clinton years, Bill Clinton's buddy, it was his roommate at Oxford when they studied in England. Shout out to Oxford. I lost a debate there, but I liked it. It was a cool place. But his buddy was Strobe Talbot, and Strobe Talbot was a big Russia hand and a big George Kennan acolyte and student. And he was against NATO expansion at first for all these same reasons. There was only one reason that anybody ever said to not do it, and that was, will be needlessly antagonizing Russia. That was what everybody said. It wasn't like, oh, it costs too much money. They like wasting money. That wasn't it. It was, why are we going to pick a fight with these guys? You know, Strobe Talbot was of that persuasion at first before he changed his mind later and decided to champion the thing. Well, fast forward, many things happened, including America overthrew the government of Ukraine twice in 10 years, in 2004 and 14. And a civil war broke out in Ukraine with America on one side and Russia on the other, backing the two sides, fighting after that in the spring of 2014 and all the way leading up through the invasion of 2022, which we can, you know, talk more about that. But after that war had been ongoing for like 4 years, in 2018, Strobe Talbot gave an interview to the New York Times. And the New York Times reporter asked him, well, so how do you like your NATO expansion policy now? Because it was so obvious at the time. There was no big propaganda campaign against this. They hadn't bothered yet. And so it was just obvious and accepted that, like, yeah, American agitation, to put it broadly, inside Ukraine helped lead to the current set of circumstances where people are being killed. And it's a terrible thing. And so this is not an exact quote, but the reporter essentially asks, so what do you have to say for yourself, pal? You know? And Strobe Talbot, this is a very close approximation to the direct quotation here. I'm slightly paraphrasing. This is essentially what he says. He says, listen, when you're in power, then there's only one rule, and that is you do what you can in your country's interest. And if you don't do that, then you won't be in power very long. And then he says, which that's crucial too. And then he says, now, should we have had a higher, wiser conception of America's national interests? Maybe. Right? So now, this is a guy, he's essentially, again, just talking about time preference. And what he's saying, essentially, here's where I'm kind of interpreting this for you a little bit. What he's saying is, if we didn't take full advantage of Russian weakness at the time, then we wouldn't have got all those Lockheed dollars. And we wouldn't have gotten all those Polish votes for our reelection in 1996. We wouldn't have been in power very long if we didn't do everything we could to pursue this policy for these narrow interests, right? And then when he says a higher, wiser, what he should have said is, should we have had a lower time preference and a wiser point of view, right? In other words, when he's saying, should we have had a higher, wiser concept of our national interest, what he means is, shouldn't we have sort of zoomed out a little bit from our own kind of interests as Democrats trying to get reelected and needing Lockheed dollars and Polish votes? And should we have taken a higher and wiser conception of whether it's a good idea to expand our military alliance into the former Warsaw Pact and even into the former Soviet republics at Russian expense, knowing that there's a potential for a completely explosive, maybe even nuclear response from Russia if we do so? And then he says, yeah, maybe, right? He had what was, really not seeking America's national interest. It was seeking the Clinton government's interest in staying in power. And even if you believe that, no, they were being selfless and they were trying to embody the empire and its interests here, then they still were acting on a high time preference basis. We can gobble up these countries. We can expand our influence. We can sell more fighter jets. We can, get everybody lined up so that if we ever do have a problem with Russia again, we'll have a bunch more guys against them than we ever had before, without considering that actually this is what is going to make an enemy out of them, right? It's like Anakin killing his own wife. Like, dude, you're the cause of your own problem here, fulfilling your own stupid premonition. Does that make sense? Oh, in fact, by the way, George Kennan said in 1998, he said, let me tell you what's going to happen here, okay? All the people who right now are telling us, don't worry, there's no problem, we should expand NATO and nothing bad will happen. When Russia does react, they are going to say, see, that's just how the Russians are. And that's why we need the expanded NATO alliance to contain their aggression. And he said, but you see, this is just wrong. And I'm sorry, but the fact that he said that in 98 means whatever, you can complain and say he cut in line or whatever, but the fact that he made that as a pronouncement then, and that is exactly how it has played out, would tend to lend credence to his explanation for how that was going to work. That in fact, it was not written in stone that Russia was going to rise again in this aggressive way. But in fact, what happened was they've been run by a clerk for 20 years, but a clerk who finally had had enough, rather than the way they try to portray him now. After 20 something years in power, they try to portray him as this what, like poet, right? Like this crazy romantic lost on an idealistic crusade to recreate the old Russian Empire, or even worse, the Soviet Union. Come on. All that is ridiculous, dude. It's just that they put his back against the wall. They dared him to go for it. And in fact, I even have in my book where he gave a talk or a press conference where he said, I kind of think that they're deliberately trying to trap us into this war, which I'm not sure I believe that. I think it was more like plan B, like, hey, if they do invade, oh well. But it goes to show that he should have been smarter than to do it. He said, boy, I think they're trying to get me to fall for this. And then he did it anyway, which I think was a major mistake. I think he'll end up winning the war, but regretting ever doing it in the end anyway, as a Pyrrhic victory. But anyways, yeah, I think, you know what it is? I'll put it to you this way. At the end of World War II, or I'll tell you this better. I was raised on the idea that, the reason we had World War II is because Britain and France were so cruel to Germany in the aftermath of World War I. And that was what helped lead to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party in the first place, or in the second place, right? Which necessitated that war. But then America learned that lesson, and we're so much better and wiser, and our Truman is way better than your whoever, because what we did was we befriended the Germans and the Japanese, and we rebuilt their countries for them, helped them to do it, and helped transition them to modern parliamentary democracies with a real rule of law. And they're not occupied, like we have bases there, but we're friends. We don't rule their streets, and we have not taken control of their countries in an old-fashioned imperial sense. But of course, the background of that they usually leave out in the way they teach it to us Americans is that, well, yeah, but we also had Stalin's Soviet Union to hold over the Germans and the Japanese heads. Would you rather be occupied by Ike Eisenhower and I always forget his name, MacArthur over there in Japan, or would you rather be occupied by Joe Stalin's men? So it was a very easy choice for the West Germans and for the Japanese to say, yeah, no, you stay. We'd rather surrender to you than to them, and be ruled, under your influence rather than their total commie domination, right? But the thing is, so after the Cold War, the George H.W. Bush government, the Bush senior government, and the Bill Clinton government, and probably even the W. Bush government, but especially those first two, they did say, we have to remember the lessons of Versailles. Again, George H.W. Bush, I don't want to tap dance on the Berlin Wall. I don't want to rub their face in it. I don't want to exploit Russia in a way that's just going to breed resentment and lead to the rise of right-wing nationalism against the West in that country. Because, especially, America did not occupy Moscow, right? The Soviet Union fell, but we didn't conquer them. We just outlasted their crappy regime. But we didn't have our own MacArthur to rule as viceroy in Moscow and rebuild their society on American lines under absolute, bayonet at their throat, the way it was with the Japanese and with the West Germans. And so there were a lot of people inside the American foreign policy establishment who thought, hey, what's the hurry in helping them rebuild and get their act together? Because, you might spout a bunch of high-minded slogans about, because we want to be friends with them and we want them to like us and we want to be good sports and we want for them to be grateful about how nice we were to them during their hardest time and all that. But I'm looking at it like, no, you're just going to make them a powerful competitor against us again. And the longer that takes, the better. So screw the spirit of cooperation. We want them as weak as possible for as long as possible. And why would we help them get ahead when we don't control their capital city in the way that we did control Bonn and we did control Tokyo, right? And so that was a big part of it and I think it was totally wrong. I think they would have gotten so much more mileage out of treating the Russians with basic respect. I mean, another small kind of aspect of this, although only like in the coverage, it's actually huge, is the huge pipeline war that Bill Clinton waged. And even including at the end of the 90s in the second Chechen war, backing the Chechen terrorists as long as they're suicide bombing and killing Russians and disrupting the Russians' ability to reopen an old Soviet pipeline through the Caucasus Mountains to get, I think, mostly oil, but maybe some natural gas out of the Caspian Basin. And the American policy at the time was, since the Soviet Union lost everything in the southern Caucasus Mountains and below, we got to get in there and we got to get all of that, and we got to make sure that all those soda straws go south and west and none of them go through Russia. And then ultimately they decided they wouldn't let any go through Iran either. That's why they did what you may know of the BTC pipeline, the Baku Tbilisi Jayan pipeline, that takes gas from the Caspian Basin and takes it essentially due west to the Mediterranean Sea instead of allowing it to go north through the Caucasus or south through Iran. So this became a huge policy. And again, a policy that Strobe Talbot originally opposed because it was an unnecessary provocation against the Russians when they weren't doing anything. Why do we want to be such jerks to them right now? And then he eventually got on board for it. And there were some others on the National Security Council in the Clinton years who pushed very hard for this policy. And, you know, there were corporate interests involved too, but mostly this was a White House-led policy where it should be surprisingly, but I guess not, that essentially the idea was we got to screw them Russians good before they can right themselves, before they can get back up on their feet. We need to keep them low as long as we can. And it's completely short-sighted, idiotic thinking. Part of it maybe is even the economics, as I was saying before, the economics of these regular democratic elections, where even once you become the president of the United States, the most powerful position in the world, you got to spend half your day raising money for your next election and trying to figure out how you're going to make sure that the other guys don't get in there. And so time preferences and incentives become very skewed, and policies, I think, usually end up being skewed more hawkish than less because of that too.
Interesting. You discussed the US-backed color revolutions in Slovakia, Serbia, Georgia, Ukraine, and elsewhere. Why was Washington so eager to overthrow these governments?
Because they can. The idea is total global dominance, no near-peer competitors. And, you know, what Robert Kagan in 1996, he and Bill Kristol wrote an article demanding that America adopt a posture of benevolent global hegemony. And you can even see it from the way that they rationalize it. You can believe some of what they say about what they mean by this, and you can see how they convince themselves that this is right. That essentially America has this gigantic nuclear skirt for all her children to hide behind, right? They call it the nuclear umbrella. And what it means is nobody will ever mess with Germany, not because of what Germany will do, but because then you're picking a fight with the United States of America. And nobody wants to pick a fight with the United States of America. We've got thousands and thousands and thousands of hydrogen bombs. And so that's why Poland wanted to be in the same military alliance with Germany. Hi, Germany, our good old friends. Let's all be in a military alliance together with America, because America is warning everyone else, read the Russians, don't you come this way again, right? So they have a huge incentive to do that. And so then from the Americans' point of view, they rationalize this then as exactly like Kagan said, benevolence, right? This is all protection. It's a defensive alliance. And the more countries join it, the more no one will fight, right? Nobody thinks that Hungary and Slovakia are going to war. They're all they're members of NATO together. Any border dispute that they need to iron out, they're going to have to figure it out at a conference table because they're not willing to leave the alliance in order to have a fight with the rest of it. It'd be crazy, right? So the more it's really the same as the national government's control over the 50 states, right? You know, we don't fight over who controls the Mississippi River because there's a national government security force that is far more powerful than any combination of these states. Nobody's ever even going to try it. We just work it out another way. And then so it's their idea is, well, they're just going to be the world government then. They're just going to do that, Washington, that is. They're just going to do that for the whole world. And everybody get inside. But then the problem is there's always some on the outside, namely any country that's big enough and powerful enough and nuclear armed enough to remain independent from Washington's dictates. And so that then leads us to this major problem, right, of incorporating this massive NATO alliance, where from the Russian point of view, as Putin has said, it's like a knife at their throat. Whether the Americans really considered that to be their purpose in doing all this expansion or not, which I think mostly not, right? But to anyone on the outside of the alliance, sure looks like a hell of a threat. And but then in the meantime, and especially, when Russia was still relatively weak to its current position, it looked like the right idea was wherever, they had this mantra you may have heard, that Europe must be whole and free. And what that means is every country has to have a government that's compliant with American wishes. So when Yugoslavia was still ruled by the commie nationalist Slobodan Milosevic, who would not do what he was told, then he had to go, right? We had to go to any lengths to make sure that there was something like a more compliant regime in what was left of Yugoslavia then, just Serbia now. Same thing for if we have governments in, really, it started throughout the Balkans. And let me tell you something, there are two really great books. Well, there are three really great books on this. One of them is mine, Provoked. I have a lot on this stuff, but I cite in there endlessly a guy named Mark McKinnon from the Toronto Globe and Mail. And that's Mac, M-A-C, McKinnon, not M-C. That's a Republican strategist guy, different guy. McKinnon, and his book is called The New Cold War. And then there's a new guy on this story named Patrick Pillow. And he's now writing for us at the Libertarian Institute. And he has a Substack that's called Libertarian Overwatch. And this guy's just brilliant, man. And he has done these magnificent write-ups of each and every one of the color-coded revolutions, which includes a lot that I had overlooked over the times. And he goes all the way back, and he does Albania, Slovakia with the OK 98, Croatia, which, Tudjman died right before the election anyway, but it was Croatia 99. And then the big one was Serbia and the bulldozer revolution of 2000. And then I'm missing a bunch because he's got them all. Again, Libertarian Overwatch. He has this huge, long-running series on this, and I think eventually we're going to publish a book of it all at the Institute. And then, of course, the major ones of the W. Bush years are the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, along with the failed Denim Revolution in Belarus in 2005, and the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon in 2005 as well. And then famously, Barack Obama had the Green Revolution in Iran, where they were trying to get Mousavi in there, although the Israelis killed him recently. But that was that one. There's, you may be familiar with the Umbrella Revolution in Hong Kong. They had the Snow Revolution in Russia in 2011. They tried this in various places. And then the idea is that these aren't revolutions at all, essentially, right? They're coups d'etat dressed up as revolutions. And so they pay youth groups, they pay exit pollsters and, surveyors of different types, election monitors. And the basic template is they're doing this in countries that the Americans claim are just dictatorships or autocracies because they have, uncompliant or non-compliant governments in them. But they do have regular elections. But then the game is when the Western side loses or the Western backside loses, they just claim stolen election. We have our exit polls. Our exit polls say that, no, our guy won, not yours, and this kind of thing. And then they have endless amounts of funding, or maybe not endless, but it doesn't take endless. They have hundreds of millions of dollars or even more from essentially the public sort of face of this part of the CIA, which is the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And then in alliance with the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, which are run by the Republican and Democratic parties nominally, but are essentially these major NGOs and government-backed ones, and then in alliance primarily with the George Soros orbit. So this is, I think quite different from the sort of like pro-Likud Donald Trump type networks here. This is, George Soros has never been much of a Zionist. His interests have always been much more European focused, but he has an entire constellation of these NGOs that cooperate with the State Department in accomplishing these things. Just the Soros Foundation, and then there's the International Renaissance Foundation, and then in Georgia they had a thing, believe it or not, called the Liberty Institute, and so many more of these things. It's kind of an endless thing. When you're that rich, you can just have a lawyer write up some papers, and then now you have a new think tank. You know what I mean? So they just do that, and they have, and then through that they finance all these youth groups and all the pollsters and everybody doing all their agitating to accomplish these coups. And they don't always work. As I said, many of them have failed, but many of them have been successes. And as George W. Bush might say, catastrophic successes, right? Where, yeah, we get what we want, but the people of those countries don't get what they want. It's just one faction winning out over the other one with foreign help, which actually, on the face of it, implies that the faction that wins with America's help wouldn't have won without it. Whether they really have a mandate or not might be undiscoverable, but you would think that if they really did have a mandate, then they could win without us on the face of it. You know what I mean? But anyway, that's what it's all about. And then, another very famous one that's not really colored, but is of the same sort of species is the famous Maidan Revolution, or the so-called Revolution of Dignity of 2013 and 14 in Ukraine. And that was the one, is really the third time in 10 years that in 20 years that America had intervened in Ukraine's elections, but especially the Orange Revolution in 2004, 10 years before. And then they did it again under Obama, and that was what led to the outbreak of the so-called civil war, really a proxy war that had been brewing and run by the CIA on one side and whatever Russian agencies and services on the other, for this terrible kind of what they call low level, but not if you're caught up in it, civil war that raged from 2014 through 2022, the first year of which was the very worst of it. And they had sort of a pseudo peace deal from the beginning of 2015 that dialed down a lot of the violence, but did not prevent it from continuing to occur. And then, of course, now with Russia's invasion of 2022, the entire conflict has been raised by thousands of percent since then. But that's the lead up to it. One of the major things. In fact, well, as long as we're at that, so the major causes of the provocation of the war were America's continued push toward integration of Ukraine into NATO. W. Bush had announced it at Bucharest in 2008 that not an official membership action plan, but that basically we swear one way or the other, we're definitely bringing Ukraine into NATO. And then also was the sort of de facto membership that they got through what was called interoperability, which means standardizing all of their force structure, all their radios, all their communications and officer ranks and everything along NATO lines to make them essentially members of NATO, even without that official war guarantee. But the idea being that if NATO and the Russian Federation ever went to war on a conventional war, that Ukraine would be just another auxiliary army along with the Germans, the Poles, the Lithuanians, and the Hungarians, and everybody else coming together as NATO to fight Russia, that Ukraine would fight with us, even if, again, they don't have that Article 5 war guarantee that we will protect them if they're invaded. So in other words, that was a huge part. You can see how that's, as Mary Elise Surratt and many others commented, that this was the worst of all worlds for Ukraine. We promise to give you a war guarantee and membership in our alliance someday. And also, here's a bunch of weapons. Good luck with the country next door. And we're not willing to fight for you, and we put them in the position to get attacked and invaded. And then, as you heard him say a million times, the point of this was to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. I kind of skipped over it, but plan A was to warn them, you better not invade. But plan B was not, man, we better figure out how to negotiate a way to prevent this war from happening. They refused to really negotiate in good faith. The Russians proposed treaties. Biden essentially told them, go to hell. We're not signing those treaties. We're not even negotiating those treaties. And so then plan C was, well, if the Russians invade, then good. We'll just inflict a lengthy, costly war on them. And as I show in the book, they said it over and over and over again. It'll be the Afghanistan model. And I know you're thinking of America's horrible failed Afghan war of 2001 through 2021. Nope, not that one. The 1980s Afghan war, where America helped the Mujahideen fight the Soviet Union and helped bog them down and bleed them to bankruptcy and force them out the hard way and helped lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in fact. And the same war, yes, that Osama bin Laden just had helped inflict on the United States as blowback from the first war. And America had only just finished finally losing the second war over there. And then immediately within 2-3 months, they got the word Afghanistan in their mouths. Only this time it's let's give Russia an Afghanistan in Ukraine and inflict on them a strategic defeat. So they, again, it wasn't their first choice, but they essentially knowingly deliberately led to a massive violent conflict on European soil, far worse than the Balkan civil wars, and a war that, could very easily, well, not very easily, but at least easily without the very, could spread to NATO and to other major powers and to general conflict between NATO and the Russian Federation and even nuclear war over this cynical scheme to what cost the Russians some lives and some money to no particular end.
Russia and Ukraine came close to a peace settlement in March 2022, but the deal collapsed after British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's visit to Ukraine. What were its terms and why did it fall apart?
Well, it's complicated, and I'm going to have to go in a minute here, but essentially they were going to punt on the question of exactly who has what sovereignty over the Donbass. So they were going to essentially call for a real ceasefire and an end to the war with one of the major questions unresolved, but then also in a position where they were both much less likely to go back to war over it. And the Russians, for many years sat there, they didn't want the Donbass back for many reasons. And they were, at least at that time, discussing along the lines of a new special sovereignty over the Donbass and its actual not being taken by Russia. But then, and the Ukrainian side was willing to drop all their demands about Crimea. Putin promised not to assassinate the president of Ukraine, and they were working it out. And I don't believe it was all the way done, but it was essentially the Russians were working based off of the Ukrainian proposal for talks. And there were members of Zelensky's cabinet who said we pretty much had a deal. And then, yes, you're right, that Boris Johnson came and delivering a message also from Joe Biden that we don't want a deal here. You can't trust them. You can't work with them anyway. And we will cut off all aid from America and Britain if you make this deal. So you're going to have to choose. And this was reported, by the way, originally, I'm pretty sure the first person who reported this reported it in the Kiev Post, which is pardon me. I take that back. It was Ukrainska Pravda, which is not Russian Pravda. This is a thing that takes money from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and is owned by Dragon Capital that is owned by George Soros. So this is very much pro-Kiev, pro-Western journalism here, like kind of against interest or whatever, but this is not Russian propaganda. This comes from the pro-Kiev, pro-Washington side of the war, saying, yep, that's what happened, all right. America and, sent Britain to come and ruin the thing. And I show in the book, it's confirmed over and over again, and including when the British tried to deny it, they proved that it was true because they published a transcript of Boris Johnson on the phone with Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, explaining that, yeah, I told the Ukrainians not to do the deal. So it's all right there. And that's all in the book that goes to show. And boy, they should have taken the deal then. Their next best chance was after their great success in September of 22. And it's been all downhill since then. And it's, very unfortunate for the Ukrainians. And I guess, yeah, in closing, I guess I would reiterate that ultimately it's a huge tragedy for the Russians too. And that, if Putin is wise, at least when he's sitting alone and drinking, he should be admitting to himself that, boy, he wish he, just like Trump in Iran, really, he should be wishing he had not have done this. He had other options, but to go this far, and it has been extremely costly for Russia. And in the end, I think we'll all regret it.
Thank you. Where would you recommend readers to get your book?
Just stop by Amazon dot whichever domain works best in your country. It should be available there. I think supposedly they're going to have translations available soon, but we'll see about that.
Scott, thank you very much for joining us today, and I wish you continued success in your work.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.